Thank you for joining us for the session on developing district-wide procedures for online and hybrid learning. My name is Jill Manska, and I am the Program Director for Waterfront Learning at the Allegheny Intermediate Unit. And I am joined by Jennifer Began, who is the Senior Program Director for Waterfront Learning at the Allegheny Intermediate Unit. And Waterfront Learning is an online program that has been in existence for about 18 years. And so we come to you with that knowledge of building online programs from the bottom up. So what we are going to focus on today is the roadmap back to school after COVID and what it is like to build a district-wide online learning program. We saw with COVID-19 in the 2020-21 school year that school districts had to shift from emergency virtual learning programs to building sustainable, robust learning, online and hybrid learning programs to meet the needs of all of their learners. So we started off with figuring out how to use technology, what curriculum to use, how to switch from a brick and mortar daily education to an online education. And we were in emergency mode, and we've learned as we have moved through it. And now districts are ready to build a long-term, continually existing online learning program to meet the needs of learners who wish to learn online instead of brick and mortar. Jen, do you have anything to add to that?
Yes, when it comes to online and hybrid learning, what we found is that each district has its own unique set of needs and goals. And through today's presentation, you'll see a menu of different options that will incorporate high quality online instruction and professional development that will embrace each school district's unique needs by building a variety of scenarios on that learning continuum. And it'll build efficiency. It'll help districts understand how to transition from one stage to the other in order to build a comprehensive program.
Great, thank you. So our objectives for today are, we are going to examine the lessons learned and solutions for virtual and hybrid learning that came from a case study by Bellwether Education. And the name of that case study is Promise in the Time of Quarantine. And the other objective for today is to provide tips and strategies to retool your virtual and hybrid learning programs from emergency mode to a sustainable virtual learning program using proven nationally normed standards and recommendations from research-based organizations. So the Promise in the Time of Quarantine study case study by Bellwether. You'll note that in the first bullet on this slide, you can read this case study in its entirety at the website listed here in the first bullet. And what this case study did is they examined COVID-19's impact on schools and their instructional delivery and practices in light of school closures and hybrid models during the COVID impact. And they identified promising and best practices that school districts used to the common challenges that COVID brought. But then they also looked at some promising practices that districts adopted kind of as we entered the post-COVID era. Like, what can we do next year and in the following years to maintain and improve our virtual and hybrid programs that started as a result of COVID? They provided a new body of institutional knowledge to help guide schools effectively as they educate students in this new way. And so we're going to examine what those promising practices are and this new body of knowledge that maybe didn't exist until these circumstances presented themselves. Also, this case study profiled the schools that were seeking to improve just virtual learning practices overall. So some districts had a virtual program and they improved it and changed it as COVID kind of impacted their daily practices. So virtual and hybrid instructional delivery, how did districts respond during, and how did they, mitigate their efforts during COVID? Um, the biggest thing that the study found was that they combined synchronous and asynchronous digital learning. So, they had sometimes even concurrent learning where a teacher was teaching a classroom full of students and some students were at home and they were doing it on live camera, or they were doing it synchronously, completely, or asynchronously, or both. They invested in infrastructure to connect families to school. So that looks different now. When you're brick and mortar, there were events and traditions and things that school districts participated in to build a learning community and connect their families with their staff and with their learners. But they had to kind of retool that in the COVID mitigation efforts and talk about virtual ways and other ways to engage and connect families. And then they were forced to retool existing assets to build a promising virtual program. They had to rethink staffing. Who is the best teacher to teach this online? Well, what's the teacher schedule going to look like? We have some technology in place. How do we need to make it better or make it adapt to our online learning environment or our hybrid learning environment? And then they had to rethink teacher evaluation. If you're using the Danielson framework to evaluate your teachers in a brick and mortar setting, how do you adapt that framework when a teacher is teaching asynchronously online, for example, or concurrently? And they had to rethink those tools and rebuild them to adapt to the new environment in their mitigation efforts. And then we also found that, the struggle to meet the needs of students with special needs was present throughout every school in this case study. How do you provide adaptations and modifications and supports to your special education population, particularly your lower incidence populations like life skills or MDS support? They had to be creative in supporting those students and find a way that they can combine in-person and online efforts to meet the needs of those learners. So this study ultimately came up with a list of items that they believe that schools should focus to build sustainable virtual and hybrid learning programs post-COVID. And Jen's going to go over the first three of those with you, and then I'll go over the second three.
So for districts that are considering building that sustainable program, it's very important to look at district-wide policies and procedures to address that environment. So board policies, attendance policies, acceptable use policies are all very important. In addition, looking at student and parent handbooks, helping to address what are the student expectations in that learning environment? How are parents able to sustain and help within that environment? All of that continues to build towards an innovative program that focuses on the whole child. And that whole child is from an academic point of view, as well as the whole social emotional well-being. And when we look at the program, it's important that we look at a program both during the traditional school year as well as summer to adjust to any learning loss that needs to happen or any additional programming to make sure that that student is taken care of from every aspect of their learning portfolio. We're also looking at how to design that school day. We need to really concentrate on, number one, fitting multiple learning environments, how to best help students to learn within that environment, whether it is brick and mortar, whether it is a blended environment between brick and mortar and hybrid, also whether it's just full asynchronous online learning. But continuing to build those on-ramps to design that school day to fit that student learner, and then also to equip the teacher in order to be an engaged virtual learning teacher or facilitator.
The other items that we will look at that were found by this study in this presentation today is building a learning community for staff, students, and families in a virtual or hybrid environment. I mentioned earlier that, the way that people interacted has changed so drastically during COVID, and building communities and building relationships has a new look to it. So we will examine what that learning community consists of and how we can help build it as the school entity as we move forward after the COVID pandemic, or at the end of the COVID pandemic. And then also, another thing that became an issue for teachers and for schools is to really evaluate and understand student and teacher and learning community engagement. So how do you measure the engagement of an online learner? How does that look different for a hybrid learner? And how do you monitor progress in a way that meets all of your district's goals, all of the criteria set forth to you by the Department of Ed? And how do you, examine that progress, and what strategies can you use to increase and build student engagement and progress? And then finally, we want to make sure that students are equitably served in all programs. I think that one of the things that came out of COVID in schools that was pretty evident from the very beginning is equity in online learning. Who has access to the right equipment to learn from home, and how can we as school districts support those students and their families? Everybody has a different level of need. We already talked about special education and how that was a difficulty in COVID emergency education. So how can we do better, and what can we plan to service all of our students equitably? So we are going to look at each of these bullets one by one moving forward, and I'm going to turn it over to Jen to introduce the first bullet.
The first bullet, looking at building that district-wide set of policies and procedures to address virtual and hybrid learning systems. We're going to spend some time in different resources that will help you to better understand what are those standards and what are those pillars to build that program essentially moving forward. So looking at this first one, we'll unpack the Educational Development Center checklist and also take some time to look at the national standards for quality for online learning.
Okay, so the Educational Development Center checklist was developed earlier this year, and you can see a screenshot of it here in the slide. You can also access that document in its entirety at the website listed here on the slide. And what they did here is they wanted to give districts a very quick starting point to think about what you need to begin. How do you get started in an emergency, and how can you build sustainability from that? And this checklist focuses on 4 areas listed here: technology, instruction, student learning, and support structures. So what are the questions that you ask yourself when you're looking at technology, when you're building a virtual online program? How will you provide devices? How will you provide internet access? What about students that don't have high-speed internet access wired to their home? What possibility can you have for a Wi-Fi device? Are any of your local providers offering, low-cost incentives for students and families to remain at home during a pandemic? And then afterwards, the pandemic, there were some emergency programs in place, but what are these organizations going to do to help you moving forward to sustain your online program? That conversation, how to open that conversation. In the next item, instruction, you have to identify what your program's going to look like. We know what it looked like in COVID versus asynchronous and synchronous and concurrent. But moving forward, this program that you're going to build, this sustainable program, what is the best fit for you? Is it a combination? Is it one or the other? That's the analysis that you and your administrative team can make. How do you adapt lessons virtually? Many teachers did a wonderful job of using tools like Google Classroom or Schoology or Canvas to build their own courses. And some districts chose vendors to build their lessons. And some districts used a combination of both. So what will be best for you moving forward? How are you going to adapt those lessons virtually and make sure that students learn what they need to learn? Student learning is next. How do you measure engagement? How do you convey the expectations to students and parents if they're going to choose to continue to learn online? How will teachers and students interact? Will you use chat rooms? Will you use, discussion boards? Will you use Zoom or other Google Classroom or Google Meet to have live meetings with your students and your families? And, so you'll need to identify the best way to think about student learning. And then finally, support structures. A big thing I think that I kept hearing throughout the COVID mitigation efforts this year, particularly in live classrooms, is teachers felt like they were tech support. Parents would reach out to that first line of defense, that teacher, and say, I can't get my internet to work, or, my screen went blank. And teachers made such great efforts to help with technology issues. But I think that a big piece of building a sustainable program is creating a technology support system. Are you going to build a help desk with your technology folks? How do you convey that that's available to families? How do you direct them there? Do you have contracts or agreements for your equipment that you're going to issue? What happens if it comes back to you broken? What happens if you don't get it back? How do you track it? How do you inventory it? And this checklist really guides you through all of those key questions when you build your program. The next item that Jen's going to introduce is, we talked about that quick checklist there, and that's a great way to kind of start the conversation and begin to build your program. But then Jen's going to introduce a set of national standards that really take a deep dive into building a sustainable program.
The National Standards for Quality Online Learning is an ongoing project to revise those standards for quality online courses. It's also to take a look at programs and teaching that are led by a partnership between the Virtual Learning Leadership Alliance, VLLE, and Quality Matters. So when the program was starting to look at these standards, it was most important to identify the benchmarks for different states and for districts, and looking at those program essentials and best practices. This partnership between VLLA and Quality Matters took into account various backgrounds in the field of K-12 online learning. And they really took the lead to refresh those national standards for quality online courses. Previously, work had been done in accordance with online virtual programs and teaching in the work that was found in the International Association for K-12 Online Learning, which was formerly known as INACOL. And the purpose of the NSQ was really to revise the initiative to provide current K-12 online and blended learning updated licensed standards. And these are openly licensed standards to help districts and educators evaluate and improve online courses through online teaching. What you'll see through this partnership as we begin to unpack this a little bit, there are so many aspects of a quality online program. You can see on the left-hand side of your screen, many of those essential elements are focused on governance. So it's looking at the mission statement, it's looking at leadership and how to plan effectively for staff, for students, for parents, and looking also at those essential components that are comprised of curriculum, instruction, assessment. And as you'll see on the next slide, Jill's going to talk about how through affinity clustering, we're able to really see how each of these impact the other components in a very meaningful way.
Yes, this Venn diagram gives a great breakdown of how each of those national quality and NSQ standards kind of fall into their own bucket, but then come together to build a robust, sustainable program. So when you look at mission and governance and leadership, and they don't exist in silos. Yes, you might have, teams that work on those particular standards as you build your program and as you sustain your program, but they all have to kind of come together to build a sustainable program. And those clusters come together and they kind of build off of one another. And students and families and staff can work together to maximize learning and maximize impact. So what does NSQ alignment look like, in a living, breathing program? And what do districts need to consider? So this progression kind of shows like target groups of students. What do you think about as you build this sustainable program and you align them to NSQ? Are students going to be full-time online? Are you going to offer students the ability to learn in a blended environment? What about your alternative ed students? Is that part of your online program? We know you have something, in your brick and mortar program that addresses alt ed. Same with AP courses, enrichment, remediation, homebound students, SEL. Are you going to make your online program equitably available to all of those students and those target groups? And those standards really help you build the program so that you can do that. Same thing with instructional delivery. You can offer a great program asynchronously, synchronously, concurrently, blended, but you have to think those through and talk about technology. Do you want single sign-on through a student information system or through Clever or some other tools out there to make this a simple experience for your online learners? Do you want to integrate this with your student information system to simplify the grading process, the attendance tracking? All of those things are very important and figured out in the brick and mortar environment, but keeping an online sustainable program, you really need to think those through and plan those out. And the standards really give you a guide to do that. Instruction, you have PA certified staff, on your team. And you have to identify, how you're going to utilize that staff to build and sustain your online program. If you work with a vendor, for example, to obtain some of your courses, will you utilize their PA certified staff? Does your CBA allow you to do that? All of those things, again, are kind of guided in those NSQ standards. How will you train your staff? What kind of ongoing professional development will you provide? How will you obtain that PD? Can you support your staff with technology and your students? So all of that is a huge part in instruction. Curriculum. If you're using teacher design curriculum, what LMS are you going to house that on? Or could you combine that with brick and mortar teachers? Can you combine it with vendors like online learning vendors? Also, professional development is a big part of that. Your curriculum department evaluates curriculum, and they provide PD for teachers and for staff to use it appropriately. And then finally, the support services. There will be ongoing support in your brick and mortar school, and there should be ongoing support for all types of learners in your online sustainable program. Special education is a huge one. Will you orient students and families so that they know exactly what the expectations are? Jennifer mentioned the student handbook, the acceptable use policy. Those need to exist, but they need to be living, breathing parts of your learning community. So students and parents understand those completely and what's expected of them. What are you going to do with your English language learners? How will you best serve them in an online environment? Do you have NCAA athletes that want to participate in your online program full time? Are those courses approved? Will it meet their needs to play Division I athletics if that's a priority to them? Those are all considerations that you need to think of when building this program, and the standards address them as well. And this slide is an example of our definition of student success and expectations in the Waterfront Learning Program at the Allegheny Intermediate Unit. After 18 years of being in the online learning business, we have kind of developed based on the research that we've done, our alignment to standards, and work with many districts across the Commonwealth, these standards to student success. And again, we've worked very hard to align our program to research-based standards. And this is what we have just found as an example of a successful pyramid to student success. Orientation is a big part of that. We make sure that those expectations are outlined. We have a clear definition of what student attendance is and why that's important. We look at pacing. Student pacing is directly related to student success with not only their grade, but their performance. So when we see that students attend regularly, have a good participation in orientation, they stay on pace, their performance shows it. They are successful, they finish their work on time, they earn their credits, and they can demonstrate learning at the end of their time with us. And then finally, communication. Are they communicating with technology? If they have a technology problem, yes. But it's not just the reactive communication, it's a proactive two-way communication between the teacher and the learner, between the administration and the learner and their family. And we have found that, those types of items build student success. So that's just an example. Okay. So the second bullet is that we are going to address from the case study is building an innovative program that focuses on learning loss and social emotional wellness. So the Bellwether case study did identify that there has been some learning loss and that students really struggled with social emotional wellness during emergency online education. I think that's been a narrative across the nation. And, so we need to recognize as educators the possibility of unfinished learning and our plans to address it moving forward to catch those students up. It's just a critical piece. So what are some of the promising practices that were identified in the Bellwether case study to deal with learning loss and to fill those learning gaps? One of the big things is summer programming. So last summer, some districts were able to build some summer programming that was online, where they offered online summer camps, and some even offered in person, but it was a little difficult with COVID last year. So this year, they're really recommending that summer camps and summer online learning opportunities are utilized to fill those gaps with learning loss, particularly in the core content areas of English language arts and mathematics. There are many diagnostic prescriptive options that collects data on students and prescribes lessons and scaffolds that instruction, based on their needs as they work through an online program. The other option is to build a playbook to address learning loss that reflects strategies in both the process and in the content. So we're not just looking at what can we teach, how are we going to deliver it? What's that process going to look like? How are you going to scaffold the instruction? When are you going to do it? The third bullet addresses, learning deficits by conducting screening at the beginning of the school year. We've been talking to so many school districts that said at the end of that 2020 school year, when COVID hit in March and we went into emergency mode, a lot of assessment that typically happens at the end of the school year didn't happen that year. So we lost some data on our students and how they ended the year and how did they begin the 2020-2021 school year. We just lost that data. So, one of the things that I think is important is that when we start school back next year, that we gather data on those students right away, and that we begin to utilize that data right away at the beginning of the school year to scaffold and address any learning loss that data shows. Rebuild those basic skills right away and put that in your lesson planning. That is what's best to help learners progress and to catch them up from any loss that occurred in emergency mode. And then build professional learning communities where online teachers and in-person teachers can collaborate. So if you're going to sustain an online program, you're going to utilize staff both brick and mortar and online, and they should coexist. You know, common planning time perhaps, or, you know, allowing them to work together just as they would, you know, if everybody was brick and mortar or if everybody was online, so that the two programs can align and that they can help their students together. And then social emotional learning, you know, what were the promising practices identified by the Bellwether study? Successful districts kind of were implementing asynchronous online instructions for students with existing SEL programs. There are many products out there that offer video support and tools that can be utilized from anywhere. If you're in person or hybrid, they have those available to students in the library through the guidance office, where students can work through some of those issues and learn from others. We would also encourage districts to utilize telepresence with their counseling and social work services. So I'm, you know, gathering folks and speaking to them synchronously and offering them and directing them to support services for social emotional wellness is a really large piece. Some districts in that third bullet had, you know, regular meeting times where they played games with students and just met with students and did activities to kind of encourage social emotional wellness, encourage interactions, do that check-in. How are my students doing? Are they engaged? They seem stressed? They would do like daily online circle time to take attendance, but they would also evaluate, you know, student communication and any signs of social emotional needs that they could identify and refer to their SAP team or their counselor. And then some teachers just created virtual office space saying, hey, if you ever need to talk, if you're struggling academically, you need to seek help from a teacher, I'm here and I'll be available online and you can seek me out in a confidential way and we can work through any social emotional issues that you have, or I can refer you to the right folks.
So the next pillar that we'll take a look at will be to design a school day that fits multiple learning environments. And part of that day needs to include a plan that aligns online learning content and pacing with in-person content and pacing. In the next slide, we're going to look at how to align that school day in a hybrid model. And what we've learned over this year is developing the supports and the building blocks to execute any instructional model from that initial design to the implementation and launch includes many different components. We need to look at the courses of design that Jill had gone through before, those special education services, the technology support and consultation, professional development, social emotional learning, and the support for families. So when we're looking at how students will choose to learn online learning as their mode of learning after COVID, it's important that all of those supports and all of those building blocks are essentially incorporated into that plan. Districts will look at concurrently how to offer in-person and online instruction. And we know from research, it's very important that that student have some type of communication in a real way, in a synchronous way with that instructor, because it builds that relational equity that is so very important. And lastly, we need to look at how to align pacing and content to build that consistent instruction throughout the school year. That allows for assessment to be built in, for benchmark data to be attributed, and then for us to once again look at that whole child. So as we go through the hybrid learning plan catalyst, it's really important that we understand all of these essential components. We look at how do we make this a personalized learning plan for each student? How do we maximize their engagement? Because we know that not having them physically in front of us, we need to practice other modes and mediums of communication and support. We need to be able to transform that learning so that they are a successful student in the academic and social emotional learning aspect. Sometimes it means extending time and stretching those resources so that we're going back and we're scaffolding that content for mastery, or we're also looking at those intervention strategies that are so important to make sure that that student truly understood the concepts. Many of our districts during this last year and a half have truly begun to build and have finalized their one-to-one technology deployment. And that has been very important both for the learner as well as the family, because it's allowed that family to be able to support that student in the virtual learning program in new and different ways. What we're hearing from districts we're working with is parents actually seem to be more engaged now. The times that they're being asked to coordinate for conferences or for IEP meetings or for live instruction works around that family and that learning coach and their schedule to better help address the online learning needs of the student. Districts are clearly looking at how to increase staff utilization. So it's taking into consideration both that teacher of record as well as all of the other resources and teaching staff that it takes to support those student instructional needs. That can't happen without targeted professional development. And it is so very important that that professional development is sustained and ongoing. So whether it means that that teacher is participating in on-demand professional development, reaching out to either a library or podcasts or resources that the district has curated, or they're going out to vendor-related resources if they're working with a content management system and learning from experts. Another option would be intermediate units that have really filled this targeted professional development gap and have provided amazing resources over the year in curating, once again, that content that's actually been developed by the teachers in the classroom, the teachers of record, and they have been sharing their knowledge with all of their other colleagues and providing just a wealth of information. Sometimes it also means modifying that school day. So looking at the alignment of those schedules, because what we've learned through online learning is that children are working at very different times, non-traditional times than that typical 9 to 3 schedule. So as we begin to address how to build that hybrid model, Waterfront Learning has really looked at this as a 4-phased approach. We know that online learning demonstrates great promise as an instructional tool to expand and personalize those learning opportunities for all students. And through this hybrid model, we're really helping districts to meet their needs. We're working with school leaders who wish to expand their use of online and hybrid learning options. So you're having those strategic meetings, you're working with key stakeholders, you're facilitating action steps for delivery, and really looking at instructional program design and acquisition options. So when we look at that phase 1 alignment, it takes into consideration how to align the district learning goals for hybrid instruction, how to problem solve through those tensions and challenges to create that vision and plan the strategy, utilizing existing and new technologies for the educational plan. Phase 2 includes what that educational plan needs to look like. So first off, you have to educate the district stakeholders in that important research-based best practices that through this seminar and session, you have also learned what those best practices are and resources to go back to. It looks at hybrid design thinking. So you look at what is the vision of this program? What are the goals and the target areas associated? And then through identifying those pilot goals, look at action steps that are necessary for next steps and outcomes. Phase 3 is the design. So looking at the design of the instructional plan, breaking it into what we have as 4 key action plan components: planning and preparation, implementation of the action plan, design and execution, and then, so importantly, looking at the evaluation and the quality improvement phase so that you can continue to retool that plan and make sure that it actually is addressing, number one, the district goals, and secondly, the educational personalized learning needs for the students that you are targeting to assist. Phase 4 would be customization. The district would build and execute their own hybrid learning design plan around each of those phases that are associated with their own unique learning needs and program needs. Moving into each of those models, it's important to focus on 3 different perspectives because they're very different. The administrative perspective is extremely important because as the administrators of the district, the building principals, the curriculum directors, it's important that they understand how the implementation of those goals is going. So how do you look at the expectations for staff and communicate and monitor that? So planning for that professional development, strategic analysis, looking at that training timeline in terms of continuation between what does it look like to start a program? What does it look like for midpoint progression? And what will it look like at the end? That master scheduling is always so important to consider. And then, as Jill mentioned earlier, some of those state reporting aspects in terms of data collection will also need to be implemented through this timeline. In addition, it's important how to review the content that's being designed. If it's in an asynchronous platform, what does that look like to be integrated into your learning management system that you have within your district? So whether it's Schoology platform or the Google platform or Canvas, making sure that you're able to confirm that that design and that content is being exported and is available for your staff to then push out and to provide for student use. And then the last piece would be taking a look at the fiscal program and plan and making sure that it's sustainable over time. Many districts right now are really taking this into consideration as they're planning for COVID monies and ESSER funds that have been made available to their district, and how to maximize this for, number one, student programming as well as district use, but then also how to revise and look at learning loss as a sustainable program as well. The second perspective that's so important is the student perspective. The courses need to be engaging. It needs to be something more than static on the page so that the student is compelled to really take their own initiative for their own learning and really understand what their expectations are and also interact with their peers. How does that look in a virtual program for students that are not physically seated in the same classroom? It's important to consider how course modification can be met and whether all courses are going to follow the same format and expectations. The last piece is to consider the technology that needs to be reviewed for participation and making sure that it is working for that student perspective and for that student use. Oftentimes, teachers are able to really look at that dashboard and understand from an individual level how students are progressing, and then look at it from a group level or from a full class scenario so that they can make sure that they're addressing all student learning needs and scaffolding that content delivery. The last perspective that's so important in building that hybrid model is looking at the technology infrastructure. Bringing in your technology team from the district to help you plan in the phases of development, to make sure that hardware is available, that the budget is supporting the purchase and the acquisition of both the equipment as well as the content and the supplemental resources. If there's difficulty experiencing the content delivery through the learning management system, who are the network providers and the network team that you can address within the district to begin to mitigate those platform related issues? And if so, having to reach out to the vendor themselves. It's important to note whether specific equipment provides limitations if you have content that's being provided through a learning management system, because we know that all hardware does not operate the same in a virtual environment. So understanding what are the specific technology specifications in order to make sure that the student is experiencing a smooth transition when it comes to the online learning model. And lastly, as we spoke about before, it's important to look at sort of those technology policies that are important for working with students that would be minors, so acceptable use policies, and also making sure that the district has a SIPA and COPA compliant policy for non-traditional or virtual learning.
The next bullet we are going to examine in our presentation is building a learning community for staff, students, and families in your virtual and hybrid environment. It's so important to build a school community to sustain and build learning for your students and your staff. So what is a learning community? You know, who is part of that learning community? We know that it includes parents, guardians, caretakers, school staff, members of the community, of course, our students, and then our governing body. You know, we have a school board and we have, you know, committees that oversee PTOs, things like that. So that is our learning community, and that is who is there. It doesn't matter, you know, if the students are brick and mortar or virtual or hybrid, we still want to emphasize the importance of a solid learning community on student learning. We know from research that successful learning communities do the following things. They communicate, they collaborate, they connect, they challenge others, and they are challenged by the school and learning. And then they learn continuously. So, you know, they're always evolving. They're always striving for continuous improvement. So we want to be able to, in our online and brick and mortar learning community, to do all of these things to facilitate communication, collaboration, connection, challenges, and continuous learning. So how do you do that when your school looks different? You're no longer in that brick and mortar. You don't have your Friday night football games with the full community participating. You know, your traditions as you do them look a little different. So, you know, open house, you know, that's always parent-teacher nights, you know, literacy nights. How can those look different in your online learning community? Some districts did them via Zoom. Some move them outdoors with social distancing this time. How do you merge them together if, you know, post-COVID, that you still maintain your online learning program, but you want to and need to involve your virtual families and students in traditional school activities? You know, creative ways to make them hybrid. We've learned how to have a hybrid virtual board meeting. How do we make it engaging in a synchronous learning session? What activities can you do if you have folks participating via Zoom to keep them engaged and you're not just talking at them, or they're not watching the live participants, they're participating themselves? Extracurricular activity participation and inclusion. With virtual academies that run concurrently with brick and mortar education that are you know, sponsored by your school district, those students should have the ability to participate in extracurricular activities and be included in school trips and school activities that might traditionally take place in person. Of course, the guidelines and expectations and requirements for participation, you know, would need to be identified and often the same as they are for brick and mortar students. Family activity nights, same thing, you know, find creative ways to offer those in various mediums, in person, virtually, concurrently. If you're going to have an event where there's a giveaway, you can find a way to have that giveaway delivered to your folks that are going to be participating from home and not in person. Virtual icebreaker. So when you're doing these Zoom meetings, we've all been doing them a lot this year. There's a way to poll your learners that isn't just, what do you think of that? Maybe you hold up your coffee cup if you're in agreement, or if you're going to, participate that way, but just creative ways to engage your learners in both environments, and use icebreakers. You can do a virtual scavenger hunt. So ask students or participants or families to find an item in their home, and ask the folks participating in person to find it in the school. Field trips, virtual and in-person field trips include all of your learners, regardless of virtual, hybrid, or in-person, in those opportunities. And then partner with community organizations to build that community feelings. Local restaurants, if they're doing takeouts, maybe it's a takeout night where everybody wears your school colors, or something like that, to kind of keep that school community vibrant and working and moving forward. It's really important, though, to consider equity in these community building activities. Offering multiple times and locations for such activities for families that might have work obligations or other obligations. Consider transportation. Just because a student is virtual, maybe they want to participate in the orientation, in person. How are they going to get there? Are you going to support them in that? Offer them in multiple languages. Provide accommodations and accessibility for all participants. If participants, might have a disability or a special need, make sure that those are being addressed when you're offering those community building activities, because it certainly wouldn't feel like it's community building if, you're not able to participate based on a limitation you might have. And then consider digital literacy, internet access, and family technology devices. I know that districts have worked extremely hard in the face of COVID to build that one-on-one capacity and to give students the access to the internet that they need. But consider that when you're building community, because again, you can't be part of a community if you can't access what's being made available to you. So, just consider all of those accommodations. Another accommodation I failed to mention was that of, transcripts of your meetings, closed captioning to your videos. Make sure that you're prepared for all of that accessibility. The next item we are going to discuss is assess the engagement and progress of your online virtual cyber community. You want to build a program that measures engagement, and you need to identify yourself what that means as a school district, what it means to you. So there are strategies that we can put in place to engage online learners. A lot of the platforms and learning management systems offer badges and things that are available digitally that I know in particular elementary students love. They build a treasure chest, they build an avatar, they earn a badge, and then you can combine these engagement activities with your PBIS program. What's so great about PBIS is that it is very clearly identified what behavioral expectations are in all aspects of your learning. So if you have a PBIS matrix, for example, you can build that matrix to include one for your online learning or hybrid learning program. On pbis.org, the national website, they have examples of online and virtual and distance learning matrices that districts have created to align with their PBIS core values. Point systems. Students can obtain rewards for regular attendance, turning in assignments on time, participation in their synchronous sessions. You know, and I know some teachers and school districts that have been mailing treasure box rewards to their younger learners, or, you know, some candy that they normally would pick out of a treasure box in the virtual or in the brick and mortar environment. Online games, you know, anytime you can create a gamified online instruction that's motivating and students' participation in those, you know, demonstrates engagement. Of course, you know, identifying your expectations and sharing those and communicating those with your learning community is very, very important. Your handbook and your guidance documents are going to define those, and teachers need to just include those in their daily communication with learners, just as they would in a brick and mortar environment. You know, in this class, you know, we don't interrupt each other. In this class, we complete our work on time. You know, you do that in your virtual space as well. And then, you know, conduct family orientations, again, either virtually, in person, online. And then another real indicator of engagement and a practice that has been proven by research to be effective in an online space is goal setting. That students actually set their own goals along with their parent and their teacher. And they have what they call goal setting conferences, where they say, you know, during this week, we are going to, you know, attend online every day, complete a quiz, you know, turn in on my assignments on time, take good notes, and keep them in a place where I can access them and organize them well. You know, whatever those goals might be for that individual learner, you know, I think it's very important that our online staff and students work together to set those goals. And Jen is going to talk to you about identifying student engagement more in a virtual environment.
So continuing with the conversation about setting goals, I think it's important to really break down the differences between how students can remain engaged in a virtual environment and how teachers can remain engaged. For a student, what's interesting in a virtual online environment is that the time spent in the courseware is actually time stamped. So it gives you real-time data, dynamic data about how long the student has been engaged in each of the courses that they have been taking online. It also addresses the pacing, the progress, and the daily attendance so that teachers are able to communicate with the student or the learning coach, but then also communicate with the building principal or with administration to make sure that the learning needs of that student are being met. That student engagement also would appear through how they're responding to their teachers, how teachers are responding back. So it's two-way communication between the student and or the parents and then that teacher. We also often find within a content management system where students will have the ability to take notes or to highlight information or to use student techniques within the learning management system that allow them to better understand the content. Oftentimes, virtual content will be able to provide closed captioning. It'll read aloud content. It may even translate some of that content for that student learner. And then setting up the boundaries and the guardrails for the interaction with other learners is very important within the learning management system that has been designed for that student. When you're looking at the teachers, it's so very important that they have that active communication going back and forth between the families and the students. So it can be through a welcome call, it can be through daily announcements or homeroom check-ins, it can be through tiered interventions as well. And then having those live sessions where students can drop in for additional support or for re-engagement. This all is essential in terms of building that relationship equity between the student and the teacher in the virtual environment.
So the question is often asked, how do you evaluate student and teacher engagement. And a lot of schools, and a recommendation that we have developed rubrics to measure just this. It sets the expectations for the students, and it also gives the teacher and the evaluator a way to evaluate student engagement and a way to build strategies to increase it. On this slide, there are some listings of items that can be plugged into any rubric making program. Student responsibilities that can be ranked in a rubric include, they're demonstrating knowledge of expectations themselves, short-term, long-term goals. They're demonstrating knowledge of technology and learning tools. They're proactively communicating with their teachers, staff, and peers. They're responsive to feedback from their peers, from their teachers. They're maintaining an organized workspace. And then, you can define what those look like in your rubric and rank your students that way. Same with teachers, although I don't know if you use necessarily a rubric with teachers, but this could be just outlined in your teacher expectations. Are they completing their individual welcome calls to their students? Are they posting weekly announcements and reminders and reminding students of their due dates? Are they conducting one-on-one checkpoints, on a regular basis with their students? Are they providing regular feedback in a variety of formats? If email isn't working, are they calling? Are they setting up Zoom or Google Meets with those learners and their parents to keep them engaged and to motivate them? Are they using icebreaker activities and other fun ways to engage students and build relationships and communities? Are they encouraging learner-to-learner interactions in a safe, secure manner within the guidelines set forth by the district? So consider rubrics or building them to evaluate and identify engaged behaviors.
So the last bullet that we will identify today and work from the Bellwether research is ensuring that all students are equitably served. It's very important in a quality online program that's designed with policies and practices that support student accessibility, that we also look at those accommodations that need to be available to meet a variety of student needs. And as we begin to address the equity and access, we need to look at those clear policies. How are we establishing participation? How are we confirming that every student who has eligibility to participate within that program has accessibility in the location that they are in? It's also making sure that these policies are published and accessible in locations, either in the student handbook, in the on the district website, physically in the building, but it's establishing that there is a policy for participation. All learners need to have equitable access to a free public education. And so how that is qualified within the district plan is important to make sure that each of the aspects we've gone through in our program discussion today have been met and are carefully reviewed. Jill had already mentioned how important it is that those options for internet access and hardware supports have been provided to the family, and that open communication with the district to make sure that that student is supported with the different aspects of accessing the online virtual content is being provided. That needs to be mobile friendly also. So if there are offline activities, that those concerns are being addressed so that the information can be uploaded and shared back to the educator. Regardless if it's a synchronous, asynchronous, or concurrent instruction program, all of the facets associated with equity and access need to be designed. One last aspect that's a unique and interesting thing to consider would be project-based learning. And many of our districts are doing phenomenal work around project-based learning, which also lends itself so easily to that virtual online space.
Finally, The resources that we utilize today to create this presentation provide you with a place to go to begin building your online program are listed here. You know, Bellwether, the link to the National Quality Standards, the EDC checklist, family engagement information, Waterfront Learning. We shared some of our information that we use to build our online program and sustain it. And then ensuring quality and equity in education resources are listed here. And this brings us to the end of our presentation. And on this slide, you will see a tiny URL that you can utilize to submit your attendance to the webinar. And then there are 2 different links that are available here on this slide to access. There is a session code for this particular session. It is 62196, or you can use the QR code with your mobile device to register your attendance. And we ask that all participants do this so that your presence was acknowledged by PUE. And we'd like to thank you for your time today. Our contact information is there. Please feel free to reach out to Jennifer Began or myself with any questions about our presentation, and we will do our very best to answer them and support you. Thank you so much for your time here today.